In this video, I want to tell the story of a company that lost its way, how it got there, what it can do, and what the future looks like. Let's jump right in. Hi there, my name is Ruben, and I'm an expert in data, decision making, and strategy. And today we are talking about the strategy of one company, Intel. Now, the story of Intel doesn't really start with Intel. Actually, every morning when I start my MacBook Air, and I mention that for context, I'm reminded of Intel. You see, I have a 2020 MacBook Air, which means I have a M1 chip in my laptop. This is the first chip that Apple has designed themselves. They manufacture it with TSMC, the Taiwan semi-manufacturing company. Before that, Apple used Intel for 15 plus years in all of their laptops, and they are now moving all of their computers to their own design chips. And this computer is a slam dunk. It's faster than the previous ones, as expected, but this chip itself, it just performs so much better than the Intel chips, and it has gotten great reviews on performance, and the future of this chip is incredibly bright. This is the first iteration of the M1 chip. We'll then have M2, M3, and so on. And this is not really a story about Apple either. This is really a story about Intel and how Intel lost its way, and how Apple moving to their own chips is simply another symptom of all the challenges that Intel's facing. So I want to give you a brief history of how Intel got here, some of the issues they ran into, and what Intel can do, and some of the lessons for us, especially the strategic lessons if you're running a company, that we can all take from the Intel story. So first, brief history, very brief. Intel has been around for something like 50 years. Our story really starts actually about 5 years ago. Intel started having issues producing chips. They were working off this tick-tock model that they started using in early 2000s. And the tick-tock model meant that every tick, the chip will get smaller. So you would start at 65 millimeters, that's the tick. Then the tock, the second iteration, it would get some improvements, and the next tick, it would then go to maybe 55. So it goes tick, tock, and every tick, it goes from 65, 55, 45, and so on. And this all worked quite well. Intel was on phones, smartphones. They had big partnerships with Google, with Apple, of course, with the computers. Microsoft has been a long-standing partner for Intel. And things were really going quite well until maybe about 2015, 2016. They started having issues producing the 10 millimeter chips. And this seemed to be just regular manufacturing issues. It was the next step in their tick-tock progression, and they just didn't have the capacity to do this. They did not have the skills or technology to do it properly. They ran into production delays, and this is where it all started for Intel. They also had some security issues, the Spectre bug, for example, which affected nearly all the chips that Intel made over a long period. So their brand took a hit. We can sort of keep going a few years. Intel has a new CEO in early 2021, and it's really meant to turn the company around. Now, to understand where Intel is today, mid-2021, Intel is still a large company. It's still one of the largest in the industry. They, of course, still have revenue. The stock itself has actually done well over the past 10, 20 years, but there's cracks in the foundation. This production delays have still plagued Intel for 5, 6 years now. There's actually more delays now going on, even under the new CEO. And Intel is seeing this huge shift in the industry. Apple designing their own chips and then manufacturing the chips with a partner like TSMC. And Intel has to decide where to go. Historically, they have designed and manufactured their own chips. What should be the strategic focus going forward? And that's where Intel finds itself today in mid-2021. A brand that has suffered some repute, actual production delays or issues. They're falling behind in terms of chip size. For example, TSMC is producing 5 millimeter chips, and then Intel is really pushing themselves to be able to do 7 millimeter chips. So there's even capability differences between them and partners. Their competitors, AMD, NVIDIA, have actually outsourced manufacturing for the bulk of their chips, and they only design chips. So Intel is in a precarious position. The decisions they make today will have all these ripple effects over the next 5 or 10 years. So what are the lessons? So where did Intel go wrong in the last 5 or 6 years? First, I think they lost their strategic focus. So a company can have all kinds of a strategic focus. It could be technology driven, which is I think what Intel really focuses on. That is their capability to use technology to keep producing the best chips in the world, the smallest chips in the world, versus someone perhaps like AMD or NVIDIA, where they don't have a manufacturing capability. They instead focus on design and their ability to design a chip and then work with someone to create it. Slightly different approaches. Nonetheless, Intel fell behind in this key component. They were passed by competitors like TSMC, and their ability to produce smaller and smaller chips, and the chips that are required today is something they did not keep up with. So that was their strategic focus over the past 6 years, and they fell behind in it. So if your focus is marketing or brand or people or process, and you fall behind in it, now you start to have some real issues. If you fall behind in other areas that are not your focus, then that's okay. Think about Apple and imagine that Apple somehow falls behind in design, which has been one of the big strategic focuses over 10, 20 years. And they start releasing products that are not good looking. So Intel lost their focus, specifically their strategic focus. Number two, they were unable to react to industry changes. So they clearly saw this sort of slow moving changes in the industry. Apple making their own chips is not something that happened overnight. They've been working at it for almost 10 years now, and they have shown, through different acquisitions that they intended to go in this direction. We also see now Amazon, Google, and some of the bigger companies design their own chips because of the advantages you can get by having more control over the tech stack, the hardware stack. So Intel has been seeing these changes, and they did not adapt. Again, they could adapt in multiple ways. They could really ensure that they have the capability to produce all those chips and then take companies like Apple as a client in the form of manufacturing their chips. They could have dropped manufacturing altogether and simply focus on design to be able to keep up with the trends. That is, become a company that helps other companies design chips but not manufacture them. But they did not adapt to these changes, and the changes happened to them. The third thing, related to point two, is that Intel didn't disrupt themselves. And so someone did. This is a classic story that happens to really in so many situations. If you look at civilizations, if a civilization does not disrupt itself, if they don't raise the bar on what they do and how they approach it, someone else will do that for them. The Babylonians get disrupted by the Persians. Persians get disrupted by the Macedonians under Alexander the Great. And of course, the Greeks get disrupted by the Romans. So Intel did not disrupt themselves. They saw these changes. They could have said, we're going to go 100% on design. We're going to do all this for manufacturing. We're going to change how companies think about chips. Let them do their own design. We'll make them. These are all disruptions that Intel could have taken on themselves instead of waiting for someone else to do it, which is what happened to them. So what's the future for Intel? What should they do? Based on recent news, Intel is basically following a strategy of, we're going to do the same thing, but with way more money. So they're in the process of acquiring a foundry, a company that can produce chips. So they want to seem to double down on their manufacturing capacity to make chips. It's not quite clear if that's enough to really catch up to someone like TSMC, but that's their approach. They want to just do exactly what they've been doing with more money and more capacity. Now, they may be lucky because the Biden administration and really governments around the world are starting to think about investing much more in their local manufacturing capacities. So Intel might just get an injection of cash from the US government, which might be enough to simply upgrade all their facilities and catch up to competitors like TSMC, which is based in Taiwan and really manufactures in Southeast Asia. Is that strategy going to work? Who knows? Hard to say. In my opinion, I actually think Intel should have dropped manufacturing. It's going to be a losing race to keep trying to compete with competitors on making smaller and smaller chips. And instead, they should have focused on design and helped other companies design chips, right? So why couldn't they advise Apple on how to design chips? Why couldn't they advise Amazon or Google, and of course the countless other small companies, on how to design chips? And better yet, move into the data processing field where it's not just chips, it's other approaches. There's all this different unique cases that are coming up in the world that could require the expertise of someone like Intel's. What's the best way to process cryptocurrency mining data? What about processing data on the edge, which has become an important factor in dealing with privacy? How do you process, for example, voice recordings from a phone locally on the device so it's done fast enough and it doesn't have to leave the device? This, I think, are all use cases that Intel could have taken on and advised and built a company around instead of trying to compete on manufacturing. That's my opinion. I guess we'll find out in 5 or 10 years, maybe come back to this video, see how it goes. But keep the lessons in mind. What's your strategic focus? And are you spending enough to maintain leadership in it? What are the industry changes? And are you adapting to them and making the most of any disruption? And of course, the third, are you disrupting yourself? Because if you don't, someone else will do that. And that's all I have for today. This is a great little case study on Intel and how to think about strategy. This is something I help companies do, be able to facilitate and help them design a strategy that can survive some of this crazy times we live in. As always, make sure to like, subscribe, share this video. You'll have buttons all around you. And in the description box below, you'll find a few links that I think are quite helpful. First is my book, The Data Mirage. This book is out in any bookstore and it helps companies understand how to get more insights out of their data. The second link is my weekly newsletter, The Growth Needle. This written format will give you similar ideas to what we're talking about today, and of course in a more consistent cadence. And third is Twitter, where I post some of these tidbits and ideas in a more raw format, a little bit more cutting edge. So check that out. Another way to learn a few more things about data, decision making, and of course strategy. In the comments below, put your questions, reactions, comments, thoughts. I'd love to read them, and I'm sure other people will love to read them as well. Until next time, talk soon.